Today I won't be talking about causal effects of race. The first time ever, I think, I'll be talking about illusory ideologies. I'm definitely taking the workshop part of this workshop very seriously. This is extremely workshop material, so I'm really excited to talk about these very kind of still preliminary ideas. So I guess I'll just start. And people should please feel free to interrupt me or ask questions during, or if Johannes feels strongly, of course, we don't have to do that, but I feel comfortable with that. And if something goes sideways, just shout out because I can't really see most of you. Okay. So there are basically, also my talk today is called Predictive Algorithms and Illusory Ideologies. So there are kind of two popular main strands of critique of database predictive algorithms or machine learning models. I'm just going to kind of use all these interchangeably, but what I'm talking about here are database predictive models that try to predict like individual behaviors. There's a kind of first straightforward ethical critique, which is that, decision-making, these tools perpetrate harms, they're discriminatory, they're tools of oppression, litany of charges, and we should reject them on these grounds. The problem with this tack is that at least in the discourse, is that the interlocutors so clearly kind of diverge on substantive, like normative standards, that the debate kind of stops before it can really even start. And so people who are familiar with this field of kind of algorithmic fairness might be familiar with these like impossibility of fairness theorems, which are basically, there are many different statistical notions that you might think are constitutive of fairness or logically required of fairness or give us good evidence to believe a system is fair, but they're not all satisfiable at once. And so we have to choose among them. And then the kind of discourse is largely fizzled out from that point. The other road of critique looks to me predictive algorithms more like on their home turf, challenging them as like epistemic tools. So these try to kind of reroute around the substantive normative disagreement and challenges the supposed primacy of these tools to actually do what it is that they advertise, right? They're actually, these claims say like, actually predictive algorithms are actually not that accurate. Their data that they use are biased, as in they're not representative of how the world really is. The correlations they dredge up are spurious. They don't actually latch onto real causal relations. They're more biased than, let's say, humans in decision making. So the problem, I think, with this approach is that this critical scrutiny of these systems often takes these particular routes that can actually be addressed when the technologies get improved, right? So you can actually make a machine learning model better, and you can make your data better, and you can, perhaps the system can learn cause and effect. And then it looks like this kind of critique just won't really go through. So I want to put forth today neither kind of a straightforward ethical critique of these sorts of systems, nor one that focuses just on the fact that they're draw on or dish out a distorted view of reality. And instead, I want to argue that algorithmic systems present first a systematically limited perspective on how our social systems work, whereas this limitation can't be, I think, accurately described as distortionary or false in the sense favored by those who take the kind of second tack of epistemic critique. Instead, I want to just draw a distinction between an explanation that predictive algorithms suggest that's plainly kind of wrong or erroneous versus one that's notably partial or lacks depth. And my critique is going to be that explanations that predictive models give are of that latter kind, where they might be accurate and that they might actually trace genuine causal relations, but that they have a particular, offer the systematically limited view of how the social world works. And then I want to show why we should care about this particular kind of shortcoming, which is that I think it facilitates a certain kind of understanding of the social world and how it works that can be pernicious and can actually reinforce existing relations of oppression. So this kind of systematically limited perspective about how the social world works performs a certain social function, right? It reinforces existing relations of oppression. And so this is going to make for an ideology critique of database predictive algorithms. So before I say more about that, I want to say some stuff about ideology, which is, a term that enjoys a truly shocking diversity of uses. So I'll just say a bit about what I mean when I'm talking about database predictive algorithms putting forth ideological illusions. So I'll take a very kind of wide view of ideologies here. I'll won't just take a view that they're just kind of systems of belief, but also conceptual schema and social practices, where the key is that they're characterized by the simultaneous truth and falsity. So they correspond kind of at once adequately and inadequately to reality, which is that they're not outright false representations that you actually appear true, but at the same time they systematically mislead. They're socially induced. In that sense, they're kind of true as a feature of that kind of reality, but they're kind of they further epistemic mistakes, but they have those mistakes kind of have reasons to them. And I want to emphasize this point to kind of distinguish illusions from delusions, where delusions are kind of more straightforwardly false misrepresentations of reality. They're more like trick mirrors fashioned by some to, let's say, warp others' perceptions. In contrast, an ideological illusion is more like a mirage. It's a feature of our landscape that emerges from within the operation of the social system to present, an appearance of things that systematically instill false beliefs about how the social institutions work, but in a way that kind of confirms the truth of the appearances. And ideologies are also functional in two senses. First, they're part of our kind of sense making of the world. They function to mediate social interactions, but more importantly, in the pejorative sense, they were sustaining oppressive social structures. And so ideology critique then consists, I think, of, like, this is from Geuss, kind of three different strands. First, there's an epistemic dimension of ideology critique, which the goal here is to kind of unmask or reveal the illusory character of the ideology. There's the functional dimension, which is to kind of, it's a kind of critical conception of ideology here, is to show that the ideology is not only should be rejected because it's false, but because it actually has a tendency to foster social oppression. And then there's a kind of genetic, which how the ideology came about. What are the conditions under which it continues to be sustained, despite the fact that, it's false in these ways. So then knitting them together, the goal of an ideology critique is to show the epistemic defect, to unmask its illusory character. That'll go some ways to undercutting its power in terms of its social function. And then we can kind of, point to the social conditions that make it possible that the ideology is sustained despite these clearly problematic features. So for my purposes then, in pursuing an ideology critique of these predictive tools, the first epistemic part is going to consist in showing exactly what I mean when I say that these systems present predictive models that suggest systematically limited or partial explanations and support misleading beliefs about the social world. And then second, in the functional part, I'm going to show why the ideological illusions perform that social function. I won't offer kind of a direct genetic critique, but my remarks on these first two and showing how they relate will also draw on facts about who designs these algorithms, who collects these data. So it'll delve into the etiology of these systems that have this genetic component as well. So just kind of to get us all on the same conceptual ground, consider as a classic example the ideological illusion that Marx calls commodity fetishism. So there are no misleading pictures of commodity fetishism on the internet. So if you go to Google Images and you Google commodity fetishism, every single image is misleading, it seems. So I just took this picture that's on the Wikipedia page for commodity fetishism. It doesn't mislead because it doesn't really suggest anything. But here it is. It's produce that is being traded in a market. So anyway, Marx's commodity fetishism refers to the fact that commodities appear to have exchange value in and of themselves, but in fact, according to Marx, their value derives from material conditions of production. So under capitalism, production is privately conducted and atomized such that it's only through market exchange when the products actually take the commodity form that the social relation between producers is established. And yet, despite this falsity that the beliefs carry their value kind of autonomously or kind of inherently, there's something true about this illusion, right? In the sense that in a market, buyers and sellers really do contract on the basis of exchange value of their commodities. And this value is a genuine value, and it actually does mediate the social relations between producers, qua marketeers. So the commodity thereby governs not only market activity, but also productive activity in a way that it appears to have these powers sort of independently. And so this appearance is actually not a delusion. So the fact that, all things under capitalism are governed by exchange value is, it's, as Marx writes, so prosaically real and by no means imaginary mystification, that unmasking that fact doesn't actually serve to successfully disperse the ideological character, right? We still, the illusion is kind of maintained so long as that reigning social system has its hold on how production works. So that's kind of a classic example of ideological illusion. So let me now give kind of a concrete example of the role that algorithms play in producing and sustaining ideological illusions. I think that'll be helpful. And I'll start off with this example and then go back to analyze it in greater detail with the kind of epistemic and functional dimensions of the ideology critique. So let's consider an algorithm that's set forth to find predictors of one's failure to properly file health insurance claims on time. So there are a number of features that the system might draw on in order to collect in data-wise as potential predictors. So might collect features like the individual's income, their education level, their race, their employment status, the insurance company they have, the facts about the claim process, and so on. And so these data, once fed into some fancy machine learning system, might well yield, excellent correlations that prove fruitful for prediction. And the correlations might even suggest an accurate causal story about, how it is that individuals come to fail to file their claims on time. And let's suppose then there's nothing wrong with this causal story that the predictive model presents, right? The explanation suggested does give an accurate depiction of why individuals in that society fail to file their insurance claims on time. So for instance, it might find that a good prediction for whether you're going to fail to file is if you're a low-income individual without a college degree and you have unsteady work or a history of failing to consistently renew your insurance plans. And those people fail to file their claims on time. Let's suppose that that's just true. So we might now ask, okay, well, what should we do about that fact, right? The algorithm obviously can't tell us what we should do about the fact that the average social and economic profile of individuals who file their claims, what that is, like what should we do about that? That we have to figure that out ourselves, right? But it seems to suggest that once we've verified that that empirical story is true, there's kind of nothing more to say about the explanation that the algorithm offers. But I want to suggest that there's actually a lot to be gained from there are key questions about causation and explanation that remain. We shouldn't kind of just stop at just asking whether the kind of empirical correlations or the causal relations are true. Because it might be the case that it gives a superficially accurate representation of reality, but that there's actually something deeper going on that's being masked by the model that's suggested. And I want to suggest that is in fact what is often happening, which is that in this case, the empirical reality that being poor causes you to be less able to file insurance claims in a timely manner, and so the empirical reality that being poor causes you to be less healthy are true, but they're true for the simple reason that they're made true by kind of undergirding social and economic order. But this fact is so deeply entrenched in social reality that it appears as plainly true bar none. And this is where I think the algorithm's model presenting an accurate causal explanation enters to actually contribute to the illusion, which is that the fact that there's kind of no deep connection of necessity between being poor and having worse health outcomes is kind of increasingly obfuscated as kind of further true details of the causal story of how it is that poor people come to have worse health are filled in. So the kind of more correlations dredged up by an algorithm to complete this causal chain of events, linking being poor to filing insurance claims late, to having bad health, the more it looks like this empirical story has been told. And, the kind of further into the recesses sinks the truth, which is that obviously having little income in a society is no risk factor in itself of any kind of health outcome, right? It emerges only as causally relevant because of the particular structures and institutional designs of, social and health insurance that reign in the society. So ideology critique then is a way for us to kind of illuminate a path towards inquiry of the social world that verifies why this state of affairs is true, right? Like, being poor causes you to have worse health outcomes on the one hand, but does it by showing how it's made true by the operation of the larger social system, right? By, for example, the linking, in our case, of income and health outcomes by, for-profit system of care, lack of socially provided resources. And so it makes evident the kind of epistemic shortcomings of the explanations that the predictive systems themselves put forth. So in this unmasking, kind of revealing the simultaneous truth and falsity of the ideological illusion, the critique shows that you can kind of stand with the validity of the algorithm's particular causal explanation without submitting to it as kind of all there is to say about the phenomena at hand. So critique takes the form of denaturalizing, right? The generic explanations that statistical models put forth, and then it kind of instead replaces them with a sort of second order explanation, like an explanation of why those causal relations are true. And so the challenge isn't to like the algorithms models directly, rather the claim is just that, accuracy notwithstanding, the tool can't actually yield the insight to drive at the true operation of the causal system. And as a result, it can't tell us what's misleading and really not true about the model's outputs. So the epistemic dimension of ideology critique here is, again, of a notably different kind than ones that focus on empirical like validity or accuracy, right? Instead, it charges that the data-based algorithms, even when they give us accurate causal explanations, present this systematic limited perspective in illuminating the kind of the whole host of causal factors. It fails to yield these deeper social explanations for the observed causal connections. And this is because it elides these background facts, right? By kind of when they're enlisted to predict individual behaviors, right? The variables and features that appear in the models and explanations are about how individuals behave and features of individuals. These are the kind of predictive markers. The existence of the social structure and the operation of the social system as a whole disappears from view and is kind of demoted explanatorily as a structure and causal factor.
Sorry, Lily, can I make use of what you announced that you said you're fine to be interrupted? I'm not sure if you saw it in the chat, someone said they wanted to slow down. And I didn't want to interrupt you to slow down, but I said, let's see if there are any questions that anyone has so far, in case you've lost people. Because I think it would be good to make sure everyone.
Thank you for letting me know about that chat. I'm sorry. It's hard to know, Zoom. I can't make any excuses anymore because we've been doing this for a year, but it's just, it's hard to remember that you're not talking to yourself. I'm sorry.
Okay, so then to make sure that everybody's on board, let me try and summarize it, perhaps also for the people who joined late. And it's my own summary. So far you've worked a lot on criticizing models for understanding causation wrong. That was kind of your existing work, right? And now you're saying, well, even if we get the causal story right in a model, and this was causation involving the social categories of gender, for example, but even if we get causation right, there's still something wrong with the purportedly good causal explanation that the model gives. And that these are the two functions, the two ideology critiques. There might be something epistemically wrong with the predictions that the models give, in that it's limited, and there's something functionally wrong in that it entrenches and reinforces existing relations of oppression. And the epistemic limitation, if I understand it correctly, is that it doesn't acknowledge and has no way of telling the story of structural influence. Is that kind of a faithful summary?
Absolutely. That's totally right. So I'm saying, like, even granting that the predictive system has got the kind of accurate causal story, like, it really is the case that being poor makes you less likely, to file your insurance claims on time. There's something really missing in that social explanation when systematically the models that you present aren't able to account for why it is the case that causal connection holds. And that lack of explanatory depth is partial in the sense that predictive algorithms, insofar as they're drawing on primarily individual behaviors and individual features, are always going to have that kind of bias. But that also, so that's sort of the epistemic critique. And then the other dimension is that there's actually something bad, there's something normatively bad about that. There's actually a bad social outcome when you systematically offer explanations of social behaviors or social phenomena that focus only on certain individual kinds of causal connections and fail to speak to the background social factors that make those causal connections what they are.
Great. Sorry for interrupting. I hope
no,
people found it was too fast.
I mean, thank you for letting me know about that chat, and just continue to let me know about the pacing. I'm going to slow down.
Yeah, and I also want to encourage everybody to use the raise hand function or clear your throat, unmute and clear your throat as a way of interrupting.
Yeah, just holler.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Now we're kind of at a natural, I guess, pause point. Okay, so great. This was a natural taking stock moment, and we can kind of charge on at a normal pace. So, you know, the problem with this picture then isn't just that kind of the social explanations offered by these database predictive systems are systematic limited, right? You know, for all sorts of pragmatic reasons, we can never give these exhaustive explanations, right? We can't list all of the relevant causal factors for a particular explanandum. The problem, a further problem, is that the particular way in which they're systematic limited serves to uphold oppressive social systems. That is, you know, by putting forth explanations of behaviors that center features and behaviors of individuals to the exclusion of these social structural explanations, they support an adoption of beliefs that, you know, when widely accepted, stabilize conditions of injustice. And it's because of this kind of pernicious social function that algorithmic explanations favor. Also, as I'll show what they in fact do, that we should reject them. So, okay. So let's go back to kind of, so I'm going to say a little bit more about this systematic limited nature and lack of explanatory depth part. So let's go back to this running example of filing health insurance claims, right? So this is correlation. We can even suppose there's a causal connection between a person's being poor and their probability of failing to file insurance claims in a proper manner. But this relation doesn't tell us the whole story about why poor people fail to file, you know, in a timely manner their health insurance claims, right? This kind of, that set of causal facts can only be understood within the kind of broader functioning of the social system. So statistical and causal facts that are put forth that focus only on the causal relation between being poor and failing to file is going to be notably limited insofar it's not going to speak to how the broader social system works. Now, this isn't a problem, though, for you know, a good predictive model, because for most, what it takes to be a good predictive model is that, you know, you just need to be accurate, right? You know, or the correlations need to just track real causal relations. That's kind of, those are the kind of main criteria by which these systems are judged as epistemic tools. But in looking to accurately predict and causally explain individual behaviors, the system then can shelves questions about these kind of second order explanatory questions about why the causal relations are what they are. And so even while the larger social factors that structure the causal relations, so while those are obscured, the causal relations among the features and categories of individuals take on an appearance of naturalness. And this is what I'm now going to argue for. So an algorithm statistical model then puts forth kind of generics, right? Generic claims. That's kind of the way that we read off these statistical models that generalize claims such as, you know, poor people are more liable to fail to file their claims on time, or Black people recidivate more. These generic claims make this suggestion or implication that the causes and correlations are true because of how the features or how the categories of the social world just inherently are. So here I'm drawing on Sally Haslinger's work on generics and ideology. She writes that, a generic claim, quote, ordinarily permits one to infer that the fact in question obtains by virtue of something specific about how the subject is so described. So, a machine learning model that sees a correlation between gender and affect is going to suggest the generic, women are mild-mannered or something like that. Or a model that kind of draws on, neighborhood wealth data will put forth, the Upper East Side is an affluent neighborhood, or, wages rise with that increased educational attainment. And the implication of these claims that this is just how things normally are or ought to be. And these are what are instances of ideological illusion. So some generics, like, for instance, the wages one or the neighborhood one, they're kind of straightforwardly characterized by this truth and falsity, right? So they are true as a matter of how the social world is, but the implication is that they're true naturally rather than kind of socially made to be true. Other generic claims are kind of more difficult to understand as true or not from this kind of semantics perspective, and I won't get into the nitty-gritties here. But the point I want to make about these claims, like women are mild-mannered or Blacks recidivate more, is that regardless of whether they're true or not as a kind of description of social reality, they suggest that there's something about being Black or being a woman by nature that makes you likely to, in this case, recidivate or be mild-mannered, respectively. And so these generics perform an ideological function insofar as accepting them serves to uphold an unjust, in this case, racial and gender hierarchy. So in all these cases, the generics that the predictive models suggest or put forth implies that the group or the category of individuals has that property or exhibits that behavior by virtue of how that group or category intrinsically or naturally is. So even if kind of, regardless of the statistical facts, even if it's true as a matter of correlation or causation, the essentializing suggestion in generic claims is false. And in cases in which it is facing kind of an unjust social system, wide acceptance of these claims serves to kind of uphold that system. So algorithmic models actually achieve this function then in two ways. So first, this kind of the normal way, which is they're in being endorsed by algorithms that are seen to be objective or, good scientific tools. Individuals are just more likely, they're kind of lending them greater credence. And so you're more likely to behave in ways that reinforce the truth of them. But second, insofar as these prediction-based machine learning models draw on those statistical findings and make decisions, that shape the world in light of the data and correlations they draw on, is kind of more like straightforwardly reinforcing the ideological illusion, right? Because, this is the critique many people have put forth, which is that machine learning, just by definition has to predict a future that looks like the past. And so in this sense, it's kind of straightforwardly sustaining this entrenchment of the illusion. So just to sum up here then, I've argued that the predictive models that algorithms put forth offer first the systematically limited perspective on social reality. They focus on these individual behaviors to the exclusion of these kind of social structural factors. And that this limited explanations, these partial explanations that often appear in the form of these generic claims are pernicious in content. They serve to sustain unjust social relations. So kind of even setting aside this naturalizing effect that we get from kind of masking social phenomena at this kind of broader systemic level, the particular claims that they tend to offer up can be pernicious in content. And so, but we might ask why this should be, why is it the case that these two should coincide? Right? That the kind of, why should it be the case that the kind of particular limited perspective set forth also happen to perpetuate, bad ideological beliefs that serve an unjust social function? And so I'm now going to say a little bit about how I think these two factors are actually connected. This is where the kind of genetic dimension of the ideology critique is going to come in, which is that the kind of limited and insidious perspective that a lot of these algorithmic decision-making systems today give emerges out of this particular set of material conditions of algorithm design, construction, and deployment that reign today. And the problem, to put it pithily, concerns who owns the means of prediction. So there's kind of this first plain fact, when we ask the question about who's making these large, complex machine learning systems, is that entry into the game of mass data extraction and deployment of database predictive systems requires, just to begin with, a lot of capital, a lot of access to data, significant infrastructure for computing power, intellectual resources and the set of skills required to build these systems. And as it happens, the kind of entities that check all these boxes tend to be like large corporations. Machine learning actually is not democratizing, these off-the-shelf tools don't actually democratize algorithm decision-making systems. Mostly the people who can actually make use of these are going to be large corporations. And so for these companies, efforts at social transformation tend to be kind of, orthogonal or just really unrelated to matters of business necessity. Unless of course the transformation is about creating a friendlier climate towards, the company's operation of their profits. So to the contrary, in fact, it's, the pressures that are generated by a social system that are actually often give rise to the complex correlations that make algorithmic prediction possible in the first place, right? So in the case of insurance claims, the forces that, undergird the employer-based health insurance regime, they kind of carve out the grooves along which the need for and purchase of health insurance becomes patterned. And that's what kind of makes algorithmic prediction kind of possible. Prediction about likelihood of clicking on an ad by Aetna possible, right? So with that kind of governing social system in place, the task of the algorithm is to use, data markers at the individual level. So, individual's race, credit history, and so on, to index social positions within that system. And so then you can kind of predict the various outcomes that those positions are going to be shuttled towards. So this makes for an overall orientation in which the kind of coercive algorithms kind of want to ride along the rather than go against the grain of these coercive social systems. The second is that the focus on predicting individual behaviors goes hand in hand with the individual being the primary data subject. So the fact that the algorithms draw on data about individuals, right, sets the conditions of possibility for the kinds of models that we can build. And here I don't just mean the kinds of optimization tasks that we're putting forth, but literally the kinds of features that we're collecting. Those are kind of the building blocks from which we can actually come up with predictive models. These are kind of the raw materials from which we can kind of gather correlative and causal regularity information. And these features are going to constrain from the start the kinds of explanations that we'll be able to put forth. So if we start with a different set of data or a different set of features, we'll come to a different set of predictors for the same kind of task. And so it's this predominant focus on individuals as the kind of the data subject that makes it the case that algorithmic systems are, focusing just on these kind of observed regularities in the social world and hiding facts about the kind of social system that structures these causal relations. So algorithms therefore kind of perpetrate this limited perspective that reflects dominant ideologies, both kind of in the service of an oppressive ruling class for two reasons then. The first is that they're just constructed by ruling classes. They're kind of, so then as a result, they kind of reflect the interests particular to those classes. And second, it's in large part due to the fact that the existing social structures kind of are what shape individual behaviors that makes it possible for these systems to predict outcomes accurately at all. There's actually kind of very little reason to unmask and potentially alter the functioning of those systems. I'm kind of running a little bit out of time, so I'm going to just go forward to the conclusion. So instead of a straightforward ethical critique or a purely epistemic one, I wanted to put forth an ideology critique of database predictive algorithms, where the kind of critical diagnosis that I've put forth is that predictive statistical models achieve this ideological effect by first naturalizing a social system that structures causal and correlative relations, eliding kind of other explanatory questions about why the correlations are what they are, the kind of larger social structural story. The statistical models support generic claims that encourage erroneous essentializing readings of social groups. So poor people are less timely with payments. Black people are more likely to be, to recidivate. And that these generics that are put forth are often pernicious in content because of facts about who controls the means of prediction. That kind of explains why the systematic limited perspective often does serve to uphold an unjust social order. And more broadly, I think, what's good about an ideology critique as opposed to these other avenues of critique. I think first, there's the kind of straightforward ethical critique, left kind of departed from perhaps distinct and moral and political premises that maybe the opposing side would kind of reject simply out of hand. But, the kind of ideology critique of algorithms doesn't so, sharply kind of lean on these other premises, but it also doesn't lack normative content entirely either. Kind of the ideology critique is able to reveal the epistemic deficiency of the ideology and thereby show it to have a certain kind of normative flaw. And so in providing an analysis of how it is that algorithmic models only present systematically partial truths, the critique calls into question the normative status of these systems. And so it kind of opens up to scrutiny the broader social conditions that undergird their influence. And this way, I think that ideology critique actually can better target the social and political arrangements of which the algorithms and algorithmic decision-making systems are just themselves products. And I think this approach to the debate about algorithmic models and so on and so forth makes for, I think, a more kind of genuinely political diagnosis of what's going on and points to more political resolutions than the other two buckets of approaches that I've talked about. I think that is all. Thank you for, being there. Thank you for sitting through that.